So they went from a fairly prosperous family to living in a cave and being on the run as fugitives. So it was really a difficult time for everybody. And David maintained being in that cave for some time. And some people decided to go down and let's see here. Get back in there where we were. There we go. So they went down, and there ended up being about 400 people with David. And so it's kind of hard to hide 400 people. And so he had to get on the run again. And so he left there and he took his parents over here to Moab. Now, if you have ever read the book of Ruth, the story of Ruth is a Moabite woman who marries a Jewish guy, and the Jewish guy dies, and she comes back with her mother-in-law back into the land of Judah, and she marries another Judean husband and becomes the grandmother of King David. And we see this in the genealogy of Jesus as it's mentioned in Matthew chapter 1. So he takes his parents over there and gets them a safekeeping. But the people who came to be with David, it says they were kind of the riffraff. There were people that were in distress. They're having problems at home. They're having problems with their neighbors. Everyone who was in debt, didn't have good financial planning in their life, and everyone who was discontented with the political situation of Saul, and they gathered to David, and he became their captain, excuse me. So those were about 400 people. And so then David goes to Moab and says, let my parents stay here. They agree. Because David is actually a distant relative of theirs. Then the prophet Gad said to David, don't remain in the stronghold, leave and go into the land of Judah. So David left and went into the forest of Hereth. So he's coming back into the land of Judah, and that means that Saul will immediately realize that he's back, and he's following this advice from the prophet Gad, which would almost seem to be bad advice. Because if he stayed in Moab, he could have, hidden out, and it wouldn't have been, the story certainly wouldn't have gone as it did. And we see here, this is the first time the prophet Gad is mentioned, but we see that he actually stayed with David the whole rest of David's life. So in 2 Samuel chapter 24, which is a good number of years later, he's still speaking the word of God to King David. So David kept, he always was involved with the priest. He was involved with the prophets. He listened for the word of God, which was way different than his predecessor, Saul. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Saul heard that David had been located, and Saul was sitting at Gibeah, which I showed you on the map up on the top, under a tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing around him. In the recent passages, we see Saul with a spear in his hand. He gets mad at David. He throws it at David. Then again, sometime later, he gets mad at David again, and he throws his spear at David, tries to pin him against the wall. A little bit later, just prior to this narrative, he throws his spear at his son Jonathan, because Jonathan is his friend, and Jonathan is saying, why are you mad at David? He hasn't done anything to you. And so here Saul is on a probably a panoramic area on top of the mountain. He's under this tree, and he's standing there with his spear. Now, this next part of the narrative, it shows a man very similar to the characteristics of Idi Amin. People were afraid of Amin because if anybody said anything about him, even if they didn't like what, a certain policy or something that he said would be the future policy in Uganda, he would kill them. Amin did something really, really stupid, which brought about his downfall. He was a guy. Let me just get back here to you. He was a guy who he didn't like anybody except Africans, and he really didn't like anybody except Muslim Africans. And the country of Uganda, prior to the independence, which happened in about 1962, the British Empire was such that the British ruled many of the nations in Africa, and they were also, they had control of Hong Kong, they had control of the land of Palestine, which became Israel in 1948. They had control of Canada, and there was a time where if you were a subject of the British Empire, you could travel to any other nation in the British Empire. And so there was very little opportunity in places like India and in China and in the places where the British were that were non-African places. There was very little opportunity. They were poor countries. And the people there were ambitious. And so many Indians and many Chinese moved to Africa where they saw better opportunity. They were ambitious people. Why do the Chinese do so well when they come to America? They can't speak very good English, but they work, and they know how to run a business. And they all come here and have a business basically. And so that's what happened in Uganda and in different places in Africa. And so over the course of time, these Indians and Chinese became the business owners in Uganda. And the Ugandans worked for the Chinese and the Indians, and they paid them low wages. And so Idi Amin says, the problem with our country is all these Asians. Just like the Germans said, the problem with our country is all these Jews. And so he passed a law, or he made a decree. He didn't pass a law. He just said this is the way it's going to be. Everybody had, if you are of Asian descent and you are not a Ugandan, you have to be out of the country in 60 days. And there was so much fear because he had been killing people consistently for a long time. And so the Asians basically complied, and they got out of Dodge. And Amin said, well, all these people, if we had our own businesses run by our own people, the country would be a lot better off. Well, the only problem was he gave this store to his pal because his pal supported him, and he gave this guy this factory because he supported him, and he gave all of the businesses in Uganda to Ugandans, basically those who supported Amin. But the problem was none of them knew how to run a business. And so even though Ugandans were running the store, they didn't know how to make an accounting. They didn't know how to budget their money. And the factory that was making the product that was going to the stores they didn't know how to run a factory, and they didn't know how to handle their money, and they didn't know how to make a shipment. And so basically, every business in the country went bankrupt, and the whole country went bankrupt. And nobody could get anything. They couldn't get, they couldn't get basic supplies at all. And so that made Amin become extremely unpopular, and that eventually caused his downfall when he was taken out of the country, driven out of the country. So here we have King Saul doing similar things. Oops. Saul said to his servants, "Hear now, you Benjaminites." Now, Saul was from Benjamin. David was from the tribe of Judah. The Benjaminites had a smaller area because it was a smaller tribe. And so, oops. So he said, I got to pick that up. Excuse me 1 second when I get back to this, because I went ahead of where I should have been. Okay. Is the son of Jesse, is David going to give you a field? Is David going to give you a vineyard? Will he make you a commander in the army? Will he make you a commander of thousands, or will he make you a commander of hundreds? Now, they weren't taking a vote as we know it, but they had an opportunity at this point to vote with their feet. And so what does he do? He does the thing that the politicians have done from the beginning of time. He seeks to bribe them with the public funds. You're going to have a field, you're going to have a job, you're going to have vineyards, you're going to have wine, you're going to have a party, you're going to be in control of the rest of the 12 tribes of Israel. Just stick with me. Same thing that's going on today. Then he says this, why have all of you conspired against me? No one discloses to me when my son makes a league with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as he's doing today. Now that last part is a lie. David hadn't done anything to Saul except be more popular in the public, because he's a warrior. He goes in, he wins the battle, he comes back, and people are saying, Saul's killed his thousands and David's his 10,000s. And so everybody likes him. The commanders of Saul's army likes him. He's married to Saul's daughter. His best friend is Saul's son. He's not trying to do anything to Saul, but the fear of losing the kingdom to David is so strong in his life that he figures he has to do anything that he can possibly do to kill him. And so he's there. And now in this particular verse, we see that he's instilling fear in the people who are around him. Why haven't you stopped this? Why have you kept quiet? Then Doeg the Edomite, who was in charge of Saul's servants, answered and said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, and Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. So we saw Doeg in the passage that we talked about last week, when David came and was hungry and asked for bread, and Ahimelech gave him the bread because he was hungry, and Doeg observed it. and he's an Edomite. He's a relative of the Jewish people. He's a descendant of Esau, Jacob's brother, or Israel's brother. And years and years and years and years have gone by, so they're not closely related, but they're from the same DNA pool. And so he says, I saw the son of Jesse. He doesn't even call him by name. And I saw him at the shrine. And so, here's the passage. Certain man of the servants of Saul was there, detained before the Lord. I don't know what that means. His name was Doeg, chief of Saul's shepherds. So Doeg, comes and he accuses David, and he accuses the priest Ahimelech as being treasonous. He inquired of the Lord. He prayed for him. He gave him provisions. He gave him bread. He gave him the sword of Goliath. So he's feeding him, he's arming him, and he's praying for him. So this is not really what Saul wanted to hear, although it was completely and totally innocent on the part of Ahimelech. But now he's in hot water for doing the right thing, because what are we supposed to do when someone asks us for food? What are we supposed to do when someone asks us for protection? What are we supposed to do when people ask us for prayer? But Doeg has no care for any of that stuff. He just sees it as a political move. And he, based on his observation, which is a ill-conceived observation, David is treasonous and Ahimelech is treasonous as well. Now let me give you here, this is just a little review from what we talked about weeks ago. Way back in the beginning of the book of 1 Samuel, we have Samuel. He is adopted into the family of Eli. His sons Phinehas and Hophni they're in line to be the priests, but they're bad people. They reach in, they take the choicest pieces of meat, they sleep with the women who bring offerings to the shrine, and God is really angry with them. And Samuel receives a word that they're about to be toast. And so the Philistines come up in those days and they fight. And so Hophni and Phinehas get this good idea that if they take the Ark of the Covenant into the battle, the holiest shrine in Israel, in the whole country, and they think that because it's the throne of God, that God would be responsible to win the victory. It's kind of like witchcraft. But it didn't work out that way. The Philistines won the battle. They captured the Ark of the Covenant and took it back and put it in their fishman god temple. Phinehas and Hophni are killed in the battle, because if you saw a huge piece of gold, and when I say a huge piece of gold, I mean pounds and pounds and pounds of gold, and a couple people carrying it, that would be the target. So both those guys were killed. Phinehas has a wife who is 9 months pregnant at the time. And when the word comes back that Hophni and Phinehas are dead and the Ark of the Covenant has been captured by the Philistines, the fat man Eli, the high priest, falls over in his chair and breaks his neck. And then Phinehas's wife has the son born right at that time, and so she names him Ichabod, which means the glory of God has departed. They have another son who's older, obviously, named Ahitub. Excuse me. Ahitub lives his life out. He has two sons, Ahijah, who is the high priest, and Ahimelech, which is number 2. So this is the ordained priesthood set up by God under Moses, the descendants of Aaron. And Ahijah, we've already seen him in several passages before today, and he is Saul's chaplain. He's the one that offers the offerings for Saul. He's the one that says the prayers for Saul. And Ahimelech is relegated to the shrine, which is near there, only like 2 or 3 miles away. And this is the man that David went to and got the food from. The king sent for the priest Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, and for all his father's house. Send a messenger down there and get that guy up here, and I demand that you bring every single person in this family with him. And they all came and they said, Saul said, listen now. And Ahimelech says, here I am, my lord. Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, by giving him bread and a sword, and by inquiring of God for him, so that he's risen against me to lie in wait as he's doing today? There again, that part was false. I hope that cough didn't come across. Ahimelech answered and said, who among all your servants is so faithful as David? He's winning wars for you. He's your son-in-law. He does whatever you say. He's honored in your house. Is today the first time I've inquired of God by him? By no means. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any member of my father's house, for your servant has known nothing of this, much or little. He's completely innocent. But he is Saul's enemy. Saul started out his ministry by the laying on of hands, by the ordination of Samuel. And previously in the narrative, he is starting to disobey. He disobeys what Samuel tells him, that what God told Samuel to tell Saul some things, and Saul disobeys, and he disobeys, and he disobeys. And he's, throughout the years, he's become calcified. He's become hardened. And now he is a murderous Idi Amin type. My wife's coming in. I'm going to tell her to be quiet. Then the king's, oops, I missed one here. The king said, you shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and your father's house. The king said to the guard who stood around him, turn and kill the priests, because their hand is also with David. They knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me. But the servants of the king would not raise their hand to attack the priests of the Lord. So Saul has now come to the place where the ordained priesthood, which is instituted to teach right from wrong and to bring atonement between the sinner and God, they're ordered to be murdered. He has completely become an antichrist. But they would not do it. The king said to Doeg, turn and attack the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned and attacked the priests. On that day, he killed 85 who wore the linen ephod. Nob, the city of the priests, he put to the sword, men and women, children and infants, oxen, donkeys, sheep, he put to the sword. So not only were the 85 priests killed, but everybody who lived in that village, whether they were old or young, male or female, baby or old man, were murdered. Oh, did this really happen? Yes, it really happened, and it's happened throughout history. I mean, I get sick of talking about Hitler, but what about Pol Pot? The what about the genocide in places like Rwanda and in Uganda? And what about the genocide of the natives in the United States? It's happened from the beginning of time. Now, the question arises, the servants of Saul, they like David. The servants of Saul refuse to kill the priests. But I would submit to you that they are still completely responsible because they did not stop Doeg from doing this. They knew it was about to happen. It was public. Everybody was there. And they just allowed it to happen. So we want to blame Doeg, and he was certainly a no good SOB to say the least. But Saul is responsible. His servants are responsible, and Doeg is responsible. And the ultimate thing that happened here is that Saul has now killed everybody that has been praying for him. There is no hope left for him. This is Elie Wiesel. He survived the death camp in Auschwitz, spent his whole life in the Never Forget movement. He was responsible, or partly responsible, for the building of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And he was a spokesman for the Jewish people. And he said this, and I think it's true: the opposite of love is not hatred, it's indifference. So here we have an extreme example of indifference. How does this play out in an ordinary Christian life with ordinary people in an ordinary state, if you consider New York to be an ordinary state? How has our indifference affected those who are around us by not saying the right thing, by not standing up for the right thing, for not telling the truth, for just standing back and keeping quiet? I think that it's kind of scary, because it makes us culpable if we do that. And that's not the thing that Jesus taught to do. Why was Jesus crucified? Because he stood up for the poor. Because he stood against the landlords who were exploiting them. He stood up. He stood for the right thing, and he did not let political pressure silence him. And so there are lessons here. There are other lessons as well, but here we have a narrative that tells a story of how people are, and how people have always been, and how people always will be. So let's look at the example of David as a good example. Now we'll see in the days ahead, as we continue in this 1 Samuel, we see that David ultimately has a chance to kill Saul. In fact, a couple chances, and he doesn't do it. And this is why the scriptures later say that David had a heart after God. There are a few places where David had the opportunity to kill his political opponents and did not do it. And, he was far from perfect. And he did some things that were horrible. But as far as his relationship with God was going, he was the best king that ever was in the land of Judea. So there you have it. If you don't mind, please subscribe. Please like the page because that will be helpful to us. And if you don't mind, and you are in fact not a brick and mortar parishioner, if you're an online parishioner, please drop a few bucks in the pot at Cheshire-church.com. God bless you. If you need anything, let me know. Please comment in the links below on what you think about this sermon. Agree, disagree, whatever. Go ahead. God bless.